Right, we are starting a new chapter. This is chapter 9 about genetic inheritance. Okay. So we really only have started to figure this stuff out in about the past 150 years, plus or minus. But early scientists wanted to figure out, how is it that our children look somewhat like us? Like, how are these visual characters passed on from parent to offspring? And dating back to even Hippocrates, it's a Greek physician back in 460 to 370 before the Common Era, or before Christ, if you want to use that terminology. He came up with the idea that there were particles that came from different parts of the body. Let's say from an individual's were transferred into the eggs and sperm, and then when the eggs and sperm merge, that all the characters that are found in your body or someone's body, now they come together and they blend, well, not blend, but they come together to form the traits in the offspring. One of the other ideas that was something I guess he came up with were that the traits acquired during someone's lifetime could be passed on to the offspring. So, like, if you had crooked teeth and you went and got braces to straighten your teeth, your children would have straight teeth because you fixed the crookedness out of them, basically. So that was a long time ago. Then in the 19th century, one of the big ideas was called the blending hypothesis. And this was that the parental heredity material, which at that point they didn't even know what the heredity material was. Heredity material. It basically mixed together to form like an intermediate version between the mom and the dad. So let's use quotes here, intermediates. One of the problems is it didn't really explain how certain traits could pop up, generations later. Like if someone's mom was blonde, and the dad had dark hair, the children, if they blended, it should have sort of an intermediate, like sandy blonde or like a light brown hair. And then when that child has offspring, it's possible that in the next generation that blonde hair could pop back up again. So it's like, how do you mix blue and green paint to get, blue and yellow paint to get green paint? You can't unmix the green to get yellow and blue again, right? Once it's mixed, that's it. So this is a little unexplainable. And this was what people believed up until about 150 years ago. There was an Austrian monk by the name of Gregor Mendel. Mendel. And he worked in the field of genetics, or the very, very early form of genetics, in the 1860s. He developed what we basically still use as modern genetics. The field of what would become modern genetics. So there's a bit of vocabulary we got to get into. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. And then this term here, genetics, just refers to the study of heredity. Okay. So Mendel basically argued that there's some sort of heritable factor that was controlled and passed down from between the generations that controlled these traits. He called them heritable factors. Heritable factors. What we now call genes are passed in discrete pieces. And so they keep or retain their individuality between generations. So he thought of it more as like shuffling a deck of cards rather than blending together like the paint example that I gave. You could get, say, a black queen and a red queen in your genetic material, but then you might pass on the black queen or the red queen to your offspring, and they would pass that red queen or black queen onto their offspring, rather than them being blended together into sort of a black-red variant. Okay. He did most of his work using peas. With pea plants. And why would he do that? Well, working with humans would be ethically difficult, for one, for his experiments, because he was doing cross matings and stuff. But also it takes, 15, 16 years for someone to reach the level where they can mate and pass on genetic material. So that's an awfully long time. Pea plants have shorter lifespans, for one. They mature quickly. And the offspring are numerous. There's also another really important reason why he was working with plants in particular, because matings can be controlled. And I'll explain how he did that. A couple more vocabulary words. A character is a feature, a heritable feature. That can vary among different individuals. So one of the things he looked at was flower color. And there were different colors that the flowers could be. And each of those colors is known as a trait. The variation of a character. Just say like the possible variation. Variations of a character. So for humans, for us, we've got blonde hair, brown hair, black hair, straight hair, curly hair. So a character would be hair color, and brown, blonde, and say auburn would be a trait, different variations of hair color. Okay, so in flowering plants, I'm going to draw a real simple flowering plant here. They have both female, I should say, and male parts. So they can self-fertilize. So the female part is known as the carpel. And then the male parts, I'm going to draw those in a different color, just so you can see them a little better. These are called the stamen. These are stamens. These are the male parts. And up here at the tips, you've got the pollen, which is the equivalent of sperm in flowering plants. And when the pollen reaches here, it goes down into here, and then that would grow up into the next generation of the flower, the seed, the pea in this case. Okay, so the way he could control the matings is he could just cut off the stamens. And then use whatever pollen that he wanted by using a paintbrush. Pollinate the female parts using a paintbrush, tiny little paintbrush, with whatever, let's say the pollen of choice, let's just say. Okay, and then when he would do these pollinations, these test pollinations, and then you would get these seeds, and then, or the peas rather, and you'd use to grow the next generation. Okay, so he had a lot of control over what the peas were basically doing reproductively. Okay, and like I said, these would grow up. I don't know how fast, but I'm thinking a couple weeks, and they'd be ready to mate again. Okay. Okay, some more vocab that you should probably be familiar with. True breeding varieties of these pea plants, or any organism. I guess these are self-fertilized plants that produce offspring that are identical to the parents. Produce offspring identical to the parent. Okay. Hybrids. So if you a little flash forward here, we're going to talk about flower color. One of the things Gregor Mendel did was cross white flowers with purple flowers and saw what the next generation looked like. So if you had all white flowers and when you breed them together, they only produce white offspring, that's a true breeding variety. And same thing if you had a purple flower and when you mate them together, they only produce purple flower, then that is another true breeding variety. But if you mate a white flower with a purple flower, that's called hybridization. Start over here. Hybridization, and this is a cross or a mating. Two different true breeding varieties. And they form what are known as hybrids. Okay. People tend to struggle with this next concept. It's really not that complicated. There are these terms that we use to describe the different generations. So think of you, your parents, and your grandparents. Okay, so for you, your grandparents, oddly enough, would be called the P generation, or the parental. Okay. These are, in these particular cases, these are going to be the true breeding varieties that we're going to use for these experiments. We're going to see how he used these. Okay. When the P generation has children or offspring, that's now known as the F1 generation. The first, they call it filial. I don't think I spelled that right. F-I-L-A-L. First filial generation. And this is the hybrid offspring of the P generation. So again, in relation to you, the F1 would be your parents. You, because you're the offspring of the F1 generation, you would be considered the F2 generation. The second filial. And this is the offspring of a cross between F1 generation individuals. Okay, F1 generation. So remember, these are going to be hybrids of these. Okay, and then we're going to breed the hybrids together to form the next generation. And if we use these to form another generation, that would probably be either the F3 or now this would be the parental generation. Okay, but let's just for now keep it simple. So the P generation is a true breeding variety, only purple flowers, only white flowers. We're going to breed them, that's the P generation. We're going to breed them together to create hybrids in the F1 generation. And then we're going to breed them together to form the third or the second filial F2 generation. Okay. So this is how Mendel did a lot of his experiments, if not all of his experiments, is just breeding these peas together and looking at things like flower color. He also looked at the position of the flowers along the stem. He looked at seed color, the shape of the seed, whether it was smooth and round or wrinkled. He looked at the shape and the color of the seed pods. They could either be kind of smooth and kind of roomy, or they could be really tight, and you could see the seeds on the outside. The color of the pod could either be green or yellow. So a lot of different characters that he looked at. Okay, let's just start with flower color. And we're just going to look at one character. And we call this a monohybrid, mono meaning one, monohybrid cross. And this is a mating between individuals, pea plants in this case, and they only differ in one trait. Or one character? Let's say character. I think that's more accurate. Okay. So in the P generation, I'm just going to put this, the P gen, okay, for the first generation, he had purple flowers, and he mated them with a true breeding variety of just white flowers. Were pea plants that had white flowers. It's not like he mated the flowers together. The pea plants that had only purple flowers or only white flowers. And when he mated them, he formed the F1 generation. And what he found is every single one of the offspring had purple flowers. Okay. All of them. Then when he mated the F1 with another F1, so another purple flowered hybrid, now we have the F2 generation. Okay, so these are hybrids. And these are true breeding. Okay. In the F2 generation, he found that 3/4 of them were purple or had purple flowers. And 1/4 of them had white flowers. Okay, I'm showing 3 out of 4 here, but really there might have been like, 50 flowers, but 3/4 of them were purple and 1/4 of those 50 were white flowers. Okay, so this right here doesn't make sense with the blending hypothesis. Doesn't jive with the blending hypothesis. because you would never see white flowers again. If blending was actually true, you would never see white flowers again after these two bred. They would only be some sort of shade of purple, right? So what Mendel did now, of course, he needed to come up with a reason or some sort of hypothesis to why this happened, and why he got 3/4 of them this way and why 1/4 of them came out white. So that's exactly what he did. Came up with actually 4 hypotheses. Hypotheses. Okay. The first hypothesis he came up with is that there's alternate versions of genes that account for variations. The inherited characters. And we call them alleles. Okay. So if you remember back to chapter 8, and we were talking about these mice, and we were talking about fur color versus eye color, and the genes that the genes that you get from your mom and the genes you get from your dad. Okay. So we're going to use that concept to kind of go through these. So again, red we're going to say is mom, the gene that mom gave you, or a pea plant in this case. So let's just say here's the chromosome that you got from your mom. Chromosome you got from your dad. I keep on saying you, and I really mean we're using the mouse example again here, okay? So if you remember, big C is equal to was it black fur? Brown, sorry. And little c was white fur. And then we were also looking at the eye color. And we said that big E is going to be black eyes. And little e meant you had pink eyes. So that's what we need. They're alternate versions of the same. So here's a character, fur color, and there are alternate versions of that character. So let's give mom brown fur, and that's also a big C. And we'll give her black eyes, the chromosome that you inherited from your mom. And let's do the chromosome that you inherited from dad, or the mouse inherited from its dad, is going to have little c and also little c. So that is going to mean that white fur, and little e pink eyes. Okay, so those are the alternate versions: big C, big E, little e. Okay. Don't know if I'm going to have room here, so I'm just going to get a new sheet of paper. Hypothesis number 2 is that organisms inherit two alleles. One from each parent. One from mom, one from dad. For each trait. It's a character. So you can inherit the same allele from your mom as your dad, or they can be different. So if they're the same, from each parent is inherited. Call that homozygous. And if it's different, if you get two different versions or two different alleles, if different alleles are inherited, that's called heterozygous. Okay. So let's say we've got a mouse, and here's the chromosome, and it's inherited from its mom, and it happened to get for fur color, brown fur allele, and pink eye allele. So brown fur, pink eyes. And the one that this mouse inherited from its dad also got the allele for brown fur. So that's homozygous. Each allele from mom and from dad, if they're the same allele, that's homozygous. Homozygous. Here though, let's say mom gave you the gene, or the mouse the gene for pink eyes, but dad gave the gene for black eyes. Okay, so they're different. That would be heterozygous. Right? Hypothesis number 3. If the alleles differ, then one of them is going to be how do I word this? If the allele, let's just say the dominant allele affects what the organism will look like. The appearance of the organism. And then there's the other version, the non-dominant, the recessive allele does not affect the appearance. So this is if the alleles differ. If they're the same, if they're homozygous, that's a different story. Okay, we'll worry about that when we get to it. Usually, as we've been doing with the eye color and fur color, we assign a letter to it, and then if it's dominant, we give it an uppercase letter, and if it's recessive, we give it a lowercase letter. So a dominant allele gets an uppercase letter. And we just kind of arbitrarily come up with these letters. It's not like they actually mean something. Not that I'm aware of anyway. And if you have a recessive allele, it's usually a lowercase letter. Okay, so we've already drawn this, but here's dad, the chromosome that the mouse got from its dad, the chromosome that that mouse got from its mom. And let's say mom has the allele that's dominant, and the dad's chromosome has the dominant. That's hard to see that that's a small c, but that's a small c. And so that would be the dominant allele for eye color. And then a little e would be the recessive allele for eye color. Okay. Hypothesis number 4. The law of segregation. And this is that sperm and eggs only carry one allele. For each character. And that's because the alleles separate from each other during the production of gametes. As you well know. So, i.e., during meiosis. We've just talked about meiosis, and you guys are experts now. And of course you know that the alleles separate or segregate into separate, cis. It is really hard to write and talk at the same time. So again, here's the chromosome inherited by mom, from mom, I should say, and the chromosome inherited from dad. And we gave mom big C, dad little c, mom big E and big E, little e and little e. Okay, so when when that mouse goes to make gametes, it is only going to have one copy of each allele. So big C and big E, big C and big E, and little c and little e. Those look identical. And little c and little e. Okay, so only one copy of each allele. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for almost 40 minutes, and then I'll pick up on part 2 in a bit.